So one quick way to get a sense of kind of the diversity of North American indigenous societies is just to look at some of the different kinds of dwellings that they live in, which you'll notice none of which are kind of the stereotypical teepee or wigwam, although those were dwellings that were used by other um, indigenous societies. But in the Southwest, where um, what are often called the Pueblo territory, you saw these intricate carved and brick built cliff dwellings like this one at Mesa Verde in Colorado. Whereas in the Midwest, like in Illinois, you would see these enormous mounds, which were the sites of these cities by the Mississippian civilizations that existed up until the period of European contact, and which were mostly wiped out by European diseases. Um, in the Northeast, where we were, it was more common to see these longhouse structures, which the group of tribes known as the Iroquois Confederation, which included groups like the Mohawk and the Oneida and the Seneca, um, would build. So again, this is just one way of illustrating that it's not possible to talk about indigenous people in the Americas or even in North America in general, because there is many important ways in which their societies and cultures were completely different. That being said, I'm going to sort of try to do that anyway, and um, talk about some of the broad differences and similarities among these tribes, especially thinking about the differences between some of the patterns that we see in North America and what we're seeing among Europeans. So, all that is to say, asterisk, what I'm about to say is a broad generalization, and you should know that there's truth in it, but it shouldn't be taken completely literally. But in general, native societies or indigenous societies were much more likely to be matrilineal, meaning that women, rather than men, as in European societies, were the ones who would own and inherit both property, stuff, land, houses, other property, and the status and the sort of family name. Um, that's a huge difference from nearly all European societies at this time. There's also the idea that the value of something is really based on how useful it is to you rather than how much you can get for it. And this has sometimes been described as use value versus exchange value as two fundamentally different ways of thinking about value and ultimately about economics. Um, the third is that, as far as I'm aware, no indigenous societies had a conception of owning land. It wasn't a thing that you could do in their system of belief and their kind of collective understanding of how things were. This was an idea that was becoming quite entrenched in Europe, although the truth is that it had taken about 150 years of brutal enforcement to kind of get Europeans to buy into this idea of land ownership as well. It's a story for another time. Um, and the last is, thinking about trade largely as a way of maintaining relationships among tribes or with foreign nations, as happened later. Rather than being primarily the way that you get money and satisfy your tribe's economic needs. And that was a very different way of thinking about trade than the Europeans were thinking, as we shall see in the upcoming slides.